Hi, Mark Granis here with the second half of Section 7.3, Rules of Validity for Categorical Syllogisms. This is part 2 because I was insane to ever think that I could put all 5 rules in a single section, but that's what I did, so at least for these lectures I've broken it into 2 parts. And today we're going to cover the qualitative rules, which is what I'm calling rules 4 and 5 in our text. And I'm also going to cover 2 corollaries about particularity. The corollaries don't change the validity of any particular syllogism, but they do give us a handy way of figuring out exactly what something comes to very quickly from looking at it. All right, let's take a look. Our agenda for today, we're going to do a recap of formal validity and the terminological rules, and then we're going to learn our last 2 of our 5 rules. Rule 4, there must be an affirmative premise, and Rule 5, the quality of the conclusion must follow the weaker premise. Then we'll go over those 2 corollaries on particularity. Nothing follows from 2 particulars, and a particular premise requires a particular conclusion. We'll finish up today by going over some examples that will help us get more practice on figuring out how we determine validity with a new syllogism that we haven't seen before. Okay, so in previous episodes, we learned that the validity of deductive inferences depends entirely on form. We don't care what the syllogism is about. We don't care what the major term is or the minor term or the middle term, whether it's snarks or boojums or wumbuses or flunnels or jagoons or anything like that. We're happy with any of that. What we care about is the form. And if the form is valid, then we know that even if we don't know anything about the substance or the matter of the syllogism, we will be able to extend whatever the premises are into new areas through the use of a valid inference. But on the other hand, if we have 2 premises that are true, we can still have a conclusion that is true even if the form is invalid, because sometimes it can be true sort of by accident. So we can use a false conclusion after 2 true premises to disprove the form. But we can never use a true conclusion after 2 true premises to prove that the form is valid. To figure out whether the form is valid, we have to use our rules of validity. Our first 3 rules of validity we called terminological. And we call them terminological because they all depend on the terms used in the syllogism or the distribution of those terms. There were 3 of these rules. Rule 1, every valid syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice. If we haven't got 3 and only 3, each used twice, we're not going to be able to bridge the gap of our uncertainty by connecting both the major and the minor terms to the middle term. Second, the middle term must be distributed at least once. If we haven't got the middle term fully distributed at least once in the premises, then we won't know whether the part of the extension of the middle to which we compare the major term is the same as the part to which we compare the minor term. So we need that complete distribution of the middle term at least once. It doesn't need to be twice, but it does need to be at least once. Third, any term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. It's fine if it's undistributed in both places. It's fine if it's distributed in both places. It's fine if it's distributed in the premises, but undistributed in the conclusion. But what you can't have is something that is distributed in the conclusion after being undistributed in the premises. That is an illicit upgrade. We call violations of that rule either the fallacy of the illicit major, if it's the major term that gets the upgrade, or the fallacy of the illicit minor, if it's the minor term that gets the upgrade. Okay, that's where we've been. That's 3 rules. There are 2 more to go. Rule 4 is there must be at least 1 affirmative premise, right? There's 2 premises, at least one of them must be affirmative. For example, look at this one. No dogs are snakes, no snakes are mammals, therefore no dogs are mammals. Now note, we have 2 true premises followed by a true conclusion. If that happens, you know the inference is invalid. And we can tell that because we know about dogs and snakes and mammals. But we want to evaluate form precisely because we're most interested in logic in circumstances where we don't know the answer, where the answer is debatable or unknown. The key about Rule 4 is that the mistake is not in the conclusion. No conclusion can possibly follow from two negative premises. If we start out with two negative premises, we're done. There's no way to save that, right? It's unrecoverable at that point. Why? Because of the principles of reciprocal identity and reciprocal non-identity. You see, if we have a major and a minor term and we relate them both to the middle term, if they both relate affirmatively, that's great. We've got the principle of reciprocal identity. We've compared two things to a third thing. They both compare affirmatively. They say, yep, that's the same. And then we can say, okay, well, then those two things compare affirmatively to each other. All right, but what if one of them relates affirmatively and one of them negatively? That's still okay. We have the principle of reciprocal non-identity. We compare the major to the middle and the minor to the middle. And if one of them matches, so to speak, and the other one doesn't, well, we know that they're not the same, right? They must be different from each other. What we don't have is we don't have any principle that helps us if neither one of them relates affirmatively. Then we only know in that circumstance what the major and minor terms are not. If you think of this with our Euler's circles, right? If you drew if you drew out a diagram for the syllogism that we have up at the top, we'd have a circle around dogs, a circle around snakes that has nothing to do with dogs, right? Like the Euler circles for the E proposition. And then we'd have another E proposition. We'd have the snake circle, and we'd have a third circle there for mammals. So we'd have our dogs entirely separate from our snakes, and our snakes entirely separate from our mammals. We would have no way to relate the dog's circle to the mammal's circle. That's the gist of Rule 4. Now note that it is possible for a true conclusion to follow from true premises, even if they are both negative. For example, we could say, no humans are fish, no birds are fish, therefore no birds are humans. So unlike the first syllogism, this one has two true premises and a true conclusion. But that doesn't prove that it's valid. It's still invalid. It has the same form as the syllogism up top, and that form is invalid, right? Because even though this conclusion happens to be true, the truth of the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily. Now, when you violate Rule 4, we call that the fallacy of exclusive premises. Exclusive, another word for negative in this case. Why? Because it excludes one term from the other term. And when you have two premises in a row which exclude everything from each other, you've undercut the basis for comparison. You can't go forward with the fundamental strategy of the syllogism at that point. So that's Rule 4. Rule 5, the quality of the conclusion must follow the weaker premise. Now, I'll explain what the weaker premise means in just a minute, but it basically, spoiler alert, if there's a negative premise there, that's the weaker one. If they're both affirmative, then it doesn't matter. The weaker is affirmative. That's the only choice you have. But here's why this works. If both premises are affirmative, right, the conclusion is going to have to be affirmative. And the reason is because two affirmative premises don't permit us to negate anything, right? If I say all dogs are animals, all labs are dogs, therefore, look, it's easy to I can come up with an affirmative conclusion, but what negative conclusion could I possibly reach based on these two affirmative premises? I can't come up with anything. An affirmative conclusion would be easy. I could say, well, in that case, all labs are animals. That's pretty obvious. But I can't say that no labs are, there's no basis for excluding anything. So I can't come up with a negative conclusion based on those two premises to begin. What about if either premise is negative? Well, then like an E or an O, then the conclusion has to be negative. So if you've got two affirmatives, you got to have an affirmative. If you have an affirmative and a negative, you got to have a negative. What if you have two negatives? Well, you can't have two negatives because of Rule 4. All right, but let's stay on this one. If either premise is negative, E or O, the conclusion must be negative. Why? Because the negative premise separates one term from some affirmative relation between the other two. For example, no humans are birds, complete separation there. Some humans are bird watchers. Okay, so now we need to have a conclusion that is going to connect birds to bird watchers somehow. But how can we do that? We've got the humans and the bird watchers united by the second premise, but we have the birds entirely separate from the humans thanks to the first premise. We can't affirm any relationship between the birds and the bird watchers. What would we do if we wanted to have a negative conclusion? Some bird watchers are not birds. If that's what you said, give yourself a gold star and go to the head of the class. Okay, so why is the negative premise weaker? There's a couple of ways to remember this, right? You can think of negative numbers as just smaller than positive numbers. That works. Or you can think about it logically. Saying what something is tells us a lot more than saying what something is not. It's a stronger assertion. It's a stronger assertion to make. So we call the negative premise, when there is one, the weaker premise. And we say that the conclusion must follow the weaker premise. That means if you have one negative premise, your conclusion must be negative, or else the syllogism is invalid. If you've got a negative conclusion, you better have a negative premise in there somewhere, or else your syllogism is going to be invalid. What do we call a violation of this rule? This has no traditional name. We could call it the fallacy of qualitative reversal. That's just sort of made up. No one will know what you mean if you say that. I'll know what you mean. No one else will know what you mean. You could just say, though, that the conclusion, you can't have an affirmative conclusion with a negative premise, or you can't have a negative conclusion from two affirmative premises. However you have to say it, this rule is the true rule. You have to have a conclusion that follows the weaker of your two premises. All right. So what about these corollaries? These corollaries deal with situations in which the syllogism contains a particular premise. I want to emphasize they don't add anything new. That is, of the 256 possible forms of syllogism out there, you get all the same results without these corollaries as you get with the corollaries. The corollaries, though, are an easy way of expressing the outcome when there are particular premises, that is, I or O premises. And because those stand out from the use of some rather than all or no in the quantifier, they're pretty easy to recognize. And so it's faster often to apply these corollaries rather than to go through the 5 rules of validity. So what are they? The first one is no valid conclusion follows from two particular premises. Right? So why would that be? Well, if you think about it, two particulars. There's not that many options. If you have an I proposition followed by another I proposition as your two premises, well, both subjects and both predicates there are going to be undistributed because everything's undistributed in the I proposition. So if you have an I followed by an I in the premises, you've got an undistributed middle. That won't work. How about an O and an O? Exclusive premises. Those are both negative. So that won't work. So one of these violates Rule 2, one of them violates Rule 4. How about either an I-O or an O-I? If you do that, you're either going to get an undistributed middle or you're going to get an illicit upgrade of the major or the minor term, depending on exactly how you arrange it. But under no circumstances are you going to get a valid syllogism if you have two particular propositions in the premises. Okay. The second corollary on particularity is a particular premise requires a particular conclusion. Boy, this sure looks an awful lot like the like Rule 5, but it isn't quite like Rule 5. We'll talk about the difference in a minute. But why does it work? Well, with a particular major or minor premise and a distributed middle, you're only going to have some of the major or the minor relating to the middle. So it's a little bit like the problem that you get with the undistributed middle. Here are a couple of examples. Some snarks are boojums. All boojums are deadly. It's easy to say some snarks are deadly, but how would you say anything about all? Where do you go with that? There's nothing that you can say about that. Or some boojums are snarks. No snarks are bandersnatches. Therefore, no Yeah, it's just you can't get there. You can't say anything universally about that once you have limited yourself with the particular proposition there. So you're not going to be able to reach a conclusion about all the major or the minor. Now, again, this doesn't change anything about the outcome in any particular syllogism. It just makes it easier to recognize when you have those corollaries on particularity. All right, let's work some examples. So here's one. No jabberwocks are jubjubs. No jubjubs are bandersnatches. Therefore, no bandersnatches are jabberwocks. All right. Now, the way to work these problems is if you need to make 5 notes, write the numbers 1 through 5 in the margin, you can do that. But we have to go through all 5 rules and see whether any of them is violated. You may already see what the problem is here, but it makes sense to work the process, right? So let's go through our rules. Rule number 1. Are there 3 terms each used twice? Exactly 3 terms each used twice. Yes, we've got our major term, jabberwocks. Why is it the major term? Because it's the predicate of the conclusion. We have our minor term, bandersnatches. Why is that the minor term? Because it's the subject of the conclusion. And we have our middle term, jubjubs, which is, why is it the middle term? It's because it's what's left over after we found our major and our minor. So we have these 3 terms, each used twice, and that's rule 1. What's rule 2? Rule 2 is that the middle term must be distributed at least once. Our middle term is jubjubs. It's distributed twice, so we're fine there. Our third rule is that we can't have any term that's distributed in the conclusion unless it's also distributed in the premises. Well, that's fine here because absolutely every term with 3 E statements is distributed. So we're fine. There's no illegal upgrade here, no illicit upgrade. But what about rule 4? Well, rule 4 is the problem, as you probably already saw. This is the fallacy of exclusive premises. Nothing can follow from 2 negative premises. You have to have at least 1 affirmative premise. And we haven't got that here. So this will violate rule 4, and this will be an invalid syllogism. All right, how about this one? Some dogs are fish. All dogs are swans. Therefore, some swans are fish. Do we have 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice? We do. Our major term is fish, the predicate of the conclusion. Our minor term is swans, the subject of the conclusion. We have then the middle term, which is dogs. So rule 1 is satisfied. Is our middle term dogs distributed at least once? Yes, it's distributed in the minor premise. All dogs are swans. That subject is distributed in the A proposition. Do we have any term distributed in the conclusion that is undistributed in the premises? Well, no, because our conclusion is an I proposition. So both swans and fish are undistributed. So there's no problem with rule 3. Do we have 2 negative premises? No, we've got 2 affirmative premises. So we have at least 1 affirmative premise. That's fine. Rule 4 is satisfied. What about rule 5? Do we have a conclusion here that follows the weaker? Yes, we have an affirmative conclusion after 2 affirmative premises. We're fine. And if we apply the corollaries, we have a particular premise, but it got its particular conclusion. So it seems like we're okay here. And indeed, this is a valid syllogism. But wait, you say, dogs aren't fish, dogs aren't swans, and swans aren't fish. All 3 of these are false. Both premises are false, and the conclusion is false. Yes, that's right. And yet the inference is valid. So there's a problem with the argument. It's unsound. It's definitely unsound. But it's unsound because the propositions are false. It's not unsound because the inference is formally invalid. Again, we always separate problems with clarity, problems with falsity, and problems with invalidity. Here, this is perfectly valid. All right, let's do another one. All wumbuses are flunnels. Some flunnels are jagoons. Therefore, some jagoons are wumbuses. What is our major term? Wumbuses. Why? Because it's the predicate of the conclusion. So it's the major term in the conclusion. We mark that with a P, and it's the major term in the first premise there, which is now the major premise because it contains the major term. What's our minor term? Well, it's jagoons because that's the subject of the conclusion. And it's also the subject of the conclusion and the minor term in the second premise. So we would mark that with an S. What's our middle term? Flannels. So we have three terms at least, each used twice, and so that satisfies rule 1. Do we have a middle term that's distributed at least once? All wumbuses are flannels. Is flannels distributed there? No, it's the predicate of an A proposition. That's undistributed. Some flannels are jagoons. Is flannels distributed there? No, the subject of the I proposition is undistributed. So flannels is undistributed both times. This syllogism will violate rule 3. This has the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Can't do that one. Okay, let's try another one. Some dogs are not friendly. All labs are friendly. Therefore, some dogs are not labs. Do we have 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice? Yes, I've got labs as my major term because it is the predicate of the conclusion. Note that it is written incorrectly. The major term is in the second premise. That's okay. Our major premise is still the second premise. It should be on top, but it's not. It's still the major because it contains the major term. How about the minor term? The minor term is dogs because it's the subject of the conclusion. And so our minor term is dogs even in the first premise. Even though that premise should be second, that's still our minor premise up there on top. And what's left over? Friendly things, that which is friendly. And that's going to be our middle term. So now let's go through our rules. Are there 3 and only 3 terms, each used twice? Yes, there are. That's rule 1. Do we have a middle term that is distributed at least once? Yes, because our initial premise there, it's our minor premise, even though it's first, is an O proposition, and the predicate of the O proposition is distributed. So friendly, as the middle term, is distributed at least once. Do we have an upgrade of either of the terms that is distributed in the conclusion without having been distributed in the premises? Labs is distributed in the conclusion, but also distributed in the premises. Dogs is undistributed in the conclusion, so we don't need to worry about whether it's distributed in the premises. So there's no violation of rule 3. How about rule 4? Do I have at least one affirmative premise? Yes. All labs are friendly is an affirmative premise. And how about rule 5? If I have, do I have a conclusion here that follows the weaker premise? Well, I have one premise that's negative. It's written first here, but it's actually the minor premise. And I also have a conclusion that's negative. So that's fine. It does follow it. So, and if we apply the rule, the corollaries on particularity, we find that they're not violated here either. That's a nice check on the way we applied our 5 rules. We got through all 5 rules without finding a violation. Therefore, this 4th syllogism is also valid. All right, that's the end of section 7.3. I'll be back next time with section 7.4.